Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. I bet you didn't know that inventing activity by Black inventors peaked in 1899, and it has never recovered. Black and Hispanic college graduates patented half the rate of white college graduates. That's just one of the reasons why you need to know about Invent Together. When our patent system gets more diverse, our nation will get stronger and more successful. Find out how you can help diverse inventors and unleash economic opportunity at inventtogether.org.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books and Film, a podcast series on the New Books Network. I am your host, Joel Cherney. Today, I will be speaking with Scott Critch, Professor of Film and Media Studies at Colorado College, about his book, Beyond Bias: Conservative Media, Documentary Form, and the Politics of Hysteria. The book was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. In our chat, Scott discusses the development and rise of conservative documentaries, along with the various methods used to present the subjects in the films. Welcome, Scott Critch. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Joel. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. I'm glad we had a chance to talk. I actually had the book for a little while, but then I finally got time to reach out and for us to do this. So the book we're talking about is Beyond Bias: Conservative Media, Documentary Form, and the Politics of Hysteria. Sort of a long title, but I frankly think the most important word in it is hysteria, which you talk about quite a bit in the book. But let's get into your background a little bit. You're currently working at Colorado College, I think is correct, and where you're in the film and media studies, and you're also the chair of the film department, or film and media.
Yeah, and this is my 10th academic year at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and of course, wrapping up a difficult, exhausting year of trying to, teach a lot of courses on Zoom and try to make sense of life during COVID. But yeah, I'm glad that we're easing into the summer and hopefully a time to relax. And I'm also really glad and excited to chat about this book and to think about conservative media from kind of a variety of angles.
Now, you've obviously been thinking about this topic for a long time. I've looked through some of the material that you've written in the past, articles and such, and conservative media seems to have been something you've talked about quite a bit. And one of the things that I noticed in both your biography and also in the book is that some of it, obviously the content's important, but you try to come up with theoretical background and theoretical reasons for many of the points you make. So what led you to wanting to first write about this as a topic in general and then finally get it into book form?
Yeah, well, it does go back a ways for me. In some ways, it goes all the way back to my childhood as someone who was growing up in a staunchly conservative evangelical household where, Rush Limbaugh was always on the radio in my family car. And so it goes back as long as I can remember in some ways. And as far as the kind of more academic trajectory, I really started to think about conservative political media right about the time I was finishing up graduate work at Oklahoma State University around 2010. And, I had been looking a little bit at that time at the Left Behind novels and films and these kinds of evangelical apocalypse films and thinking about the way in which um, conservative media was, in those cases, kind of the Christian conservative media was commenting allegorically through these novels and films on kind of the events of the day. But I think what really sparked this project is I was kind of looking around and trying to find a way into this rather kind of challenging media landscape was actually the Glenn Beck program on Fox News. Glenn Beck was the kind of most popular program on Fox News at the time. And in the kind of secular journalistic reporting on Glenn Beck, the word hysteria was used, often in a kind of off-the-cuff way to describe his performance style. He would often cry on camera, over the top expressions of emotions and rage, directed against, all of the kind of antagonists that I think, if we are familiar with conservative political media, such as the liberal media, the socialist Democrats, as they're often described. There wasn't anything particularly new in terms of the content on Glenn Beck's program at that time, but in terms of the form, his costumes and his affect. And then what really jumped out at me was his excessive use of blackboards. Right, here he is on cable news, but taking this kind of teacherly affect of writing, details and names and conspiracy theories, but putting them up in this kind of old media form on chalk on blackboards. And one of the things that jumped out at me at that moment was that the blackboards and he would sometimes have like a dozen blackboards on the soundstage at once, were so chock full of data and information that they actually were not informative, right? Even if one was trying to follow along and was trying to believe or understand what Beck was saying at that point, the information was actually working against understanding, right? One became more confused the more one followed along. And so that was kind of the moment where I first started to wanting to think about hysteria and to take hysteria seriously, not in the kind of everyday colloquial use of the term, but as someone who at the time as a grad student was already invested in psychoanalytic theory, to really dig into the archive of psychoanalytic accounts of hysteria. And then the more I did that, the more resonances and connections that I saw, not just between Glenn Beck and hysterical discourse, but rather right-wing media at large, on talk radio, on cable news, and then as eventually I would find in feature-length documentary films.
So I don't know where you grew up. I know you talked about it was a conservative household. Did you live in a conservative neighborhood or a conservative city or state?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Los Angeles area in the San Fernando Valley, and my parents attended what we would call not quite a mega church, but kind of an aspiring mega church. I went to private Christian schools from kindergarten through high school, and so in some ways I think that was also informative to many of the arguments and interests that I develop in the book, of living in a kind of massive urban sprawl of LA, but also seeing the ways in which the church I attended, the Baptist school I attended, the ways in which these institutions attempted to reach out, right, to the secular world, to present themselves in a kind of proselytizing fashion, rather than encapsulating themselves in this like narrow echo chamber. The church that I attended, we would have like rock concerts on a Wednesday afternoon, so as to appeal to the unsaved. Right, this is one of the moves that they would make, and so. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the chapter where I look at conservative evangelical documentary, I noticed a lot of the same appeals and gestures and structures of trying to make, a kind of very, very narrow ideological position to make it palatable to what they would, call non-believers.
It's funny because one of the things you say literally at the beginning, in the first paragraph of your introduction, and I think it pretty much says everything. That's why I said before, the word hysteria I found to be so important in what you're talking about. It invites the intended audience into a perpetual state of confusion, deploying the incomprehensible scenes it regularly stages to perpetuate fear, anxiety, and a general sense of discomfort about democracy as such. And of course, I underlined confusion, fear, anxiety, and discomfort. Mm-hmm. And we've said this a lot. I mean, if it's one of those topics that comes up pretty regularly when political discussions and media, where especially conservative seems to be trying its best to keep you as scared as possible as long as possible. That the more they can scare you, the more likely you're going to go along with whatever they're saying we need to do in order to make you less scared. And I think that's where, but then the confusion part where, and you said it with the blackboard, you try to say something and pretend like you're doing it as a educational description, but when you look at what the person is saying or trying to say, either in a documentary or you say with, like Beck with his chalkboards, it doesn't make any sense. It's totally incomprehensible.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think one of the things that struck me as someone who was trying to take seriously and to read the conservative media objects, how does one put it, in the best possible light, to take it seriously on its own terms. Of course, for outsiders who don't subscribe to kind of the values of contemporary conservatism, and in the U.S., it's going to look like nonsense. It's going to look incoherent. It's going to appear confusing. But what I found striking, the more and more I dove into the material, is that the very structure of the appeals, of the arguments, right, resisted coherence, that they resisted explanation, that even if one assumed that the arguments were being made in good faith, there was still this kind of underlying incoherence that led me to, I think, make the claim that part of what makes certain facets of conservative media incoherent at a kind of constitutive level, is that their arguments are fundamentally about democracy, about politics within a liberal democracy, and yet they do not invest in any kind of serious sense of the term in the democratic process, right? That what horrifies, I think, so many prominent conservative speakers, and what I think coordinates so much of the messaging in conservative documentary film, is the trauma that there are other people and other groups in the U.S. that with whom they radically disagree, and the very trauma, right, of inhabiting a country in which from time to time others might be in charge, others might be elected president, and that there's a kind of absolute resistance to this kind of basic democratic reality. And I think that to me explains a lot of the confusion that plays out in these objects and case studies that I work through.
Well, and I think this is one of the things we see, and we can use current events right now, that some of the media coverage of the election, and the fact that there's, the people on Fox News and some of the other right-wing media were making comments about the election being fraudulent. Mm-hmm. And when they got sued about it, went to court and say, well, we know it wasn't true. I mean, we're not stupid. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of like it's like they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to say anything they want to say, but they don't want to be held responsible for it.
Right. Well, I think that's again, one of the things that prompted me to jump into this project was, of course, the conservative media is highly successful. It's highly entertaining. Fox News gets viewers, talk radio gets viewers, and I wondered how we might take seriously how effective right-wing media is at directing kind of the conversation, at kind of establishing many of the frameworks of the debates the kind of we engage in, but also just to recognize that right-wing news, if we want to call it that, right, is just an effective mode of entertainment, right? Like the viewers and listeners tune in every day, and I think part of the reason for that is because they are less interested in the kind of difficult work of contextualizing events historically, of investing in journalists who will report in depth on the events of the day. They kind of slide over the kind of difficulties, if not the potentially kind of boring aspects of gaining context, right? Like I think I don't watch cable news much anymore. I don't have it on inside the house, but when I'm traveling and I turn it on, to turn on the evening news or even something like CNN is not nearly as entertaining as turning on Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity in a certain way of speaking, right? Like it's horrifying, right? But even in the same way that we go to the theater to watch horror films, there's something entertaining about the kind of the predictable talking points that they circulate so regularly.
I was thinking about this as I was reading the book. I was saying to myself, this explains to me why I get just as angry at people trying to, on social media, attacking or, trying to get these folks to listen to them. You go after, Laura Ingraham or one of them who says something so outlandish, and you somehow think they're going to listen to you. So you just say anything, and it's like, well, you're almost playing the same game. You're just assuming that if you say it, they'll change their mind, instead of just not reacting, which sometimes is the better way. And one of the ways you do that, as you just point out, is to ignore it as much as you can and avoid. I don't watch. I had the cable news on quite a bit during the election period, but not anymore. I don't need it. I get my news through enough variety of sources that it's not important. And I teach a class in information literacy, and one of the things that you will often get students talking about is they've already taken up this whole concept of fake news because that's what they've heard over and over again. And so much of that is built around the idea that they think that that's the only place they get the news is from television, which of course is one of the things that we've always seen over, in 50, 60 years since TV has become so important. And yet part of that is the idea that somehow that's that news that we see in that format must be the real news.
Yeah, I think exactly right. And I think this is, again, one of the powerful features of kind of prominent conservative political media today is that it really commits to a narrative. And narratives can be entertaining, they can be alluring. They're not necessarily good history or good reportage, but they do bring people back, and they allow us a kind of sense of consistency. In the way that this is not a brilliant insight to point out the fact that the conservative, both politicians and conservative celebrities, will describe any policy proposal that they don't like as socialist, right, or as Marxist, or as a slippery slope leading to these things that, of course, again, that seems like nonsense, and I think it is, but it plays effectively to their audiences.
And of course, it takes an important thing like gun violence or gun usage and turns it into, if we do anything. And I actually had a student throw out this argument about, if they're going to take our guns and it'll be like the 1930s in Nazi Germany, because of course they don't know that. They heard that from somebody else, and so that becomes one of the tropes you hear quite a bit. And it's an argument that has no way of proving or disproving. It's just an argument that has no invalidity, and I think that's one of the things you talk about so much of what they say. It's not meant to actually come up with a solution. It's actually meant just to keep the argument going.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and I think, again, it speaks to what I think is the rhetorical effectiveness, at least for their intended audience, is that if you have more liberal, progressive voices in this country that are pushing for things like gun reform, police reform, the Green New Deal, whatever else, like kind of addressing these kind of major systemic problems and trying to propose solutions, that's quite different from the kinds of arguments that I'm keying in on in this project, where the conservative arguments are not about a claim for a better future. They're not about and the endorsement of their policy proposals rather than others. Instead, they're kind of a a form of trolling, that their arguments are embedded directly within counteracting, right? The any proposals coming out of the left, right? And so they kind of embed themselves um, in the forms and the styles and the aesthetics of whoever they're arguing against. There's a chapter on Michael Moore documentaries that I think gets the point across quite directly, that while Michael Moore, whatever we think about Michael Moore as a filmmaker, in his early work where he's thinking about globalization and economic devastation in places like Flint, Michigan, or the histories of racial violence and gun violence in Bowling for Columbine, that the conservative reactions to those films are not addressing the political issues, the political content. They're only addressing Michael Moore, right, as an individual. They make fun of his weight. They make presumptions about his intentions, that he doesn't really care about the political content of his films. He's just trying to get rich, or he's trying to become famous, and they copy his style, and they mimic his forms all the way through. But again, not to stage a debate about guns, right, or about economics, right, but rather to distract from the real debate and make it all about the personality of the person that they're attacking. And I think that that's one of the things that I hope people will take away from the book if they give it a look, is that by taking seriously that cycle of anti-Michael Moore films, we might notice the similar structures of argument that are persistent across the landscape of contemporary conservative media. It's not just those particular films attacking Michael Moore, but rather it's a rhetorical trope that the conservative media comes back to again and again. For instance, of personalizing issues rather than engaging in a kind of more full-throated debate.
I must admit, Michael Moore is who brought me back to documentaries. I mean, I grew up in a period of time where the only thing that would quote most of what we would call a documentary, which obviously weren't, people think of back in the day, right around the time Michael Moore became well known, was the average person. You asked them what a documentary was, they'd probably say, "Oh, something I saw when I was in school," and they would show these films, and they were documentaries, which educational films aren't necessarily the same thing. And one of the things that I remember quite well, when as far back as Roger and Me, was that there was this constant complaint about how Michael Moore's films weren't fair because he takes a point of view. Mm-hmm. Missing the point that documentaries have always taken points of view. It just so happens if it's a point of view you don't like, you're more likely to go back, as you say, go after the filmmaker. Don't go after the subject, because we'll just say, oh, he shouldn't have a point of view in his film. And yet, from that point on, I mean, frankly, I can't imagine why anybody would think being a documentary filmmaker is a way to make money, but at least back in when Michael Moore first started doing them. Nowadays, if you're good at what you do, you can probably do pretty well. There's a number of documentary filmmakers who do quite well now, but it's not something that, as far as filmmaking is concerned, back in the day, because getting them into film theaters was very difficult. I remember I did see Bowling for Columbine in the theater, but it was in an art theater. It wasn't showing at the regular theaters in the city, and so it's still hard nowadays. Though with streaming and everything else, getting a film out there is not difficult, and so I suspect that has a lot to do with it too. And this is why I wanted to get a little bit more into what you saw as the history, which I know the first chapter you do go back into the background of these conservative films. I mean, what are the underlyings? I mean, how far back can we truthfully say that this period of these conservative documentaries goes back to?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I don't even know that I have a good answer to that. One of the things I wanted to avoid, was the label of propaganda, right? Because propaganda, the history of propaganda, in film and beyond, goes back quite far. We could certainly look at the, films produced by the U.S. government and military during World War II is one might describe as conservative. The Why We Fight series are certainly conservative of a particular kind, right? But I think for this project, apart from the chapter on creationism and fundamentalism, that does go back and look at creationist nonfiction films, and I guess we could maybe quibble about when the label of documentary is appropriate or not. That's about as far back as I go to the sermons from science that came out of the Moody Institute in Chicago, and Erwin Moon, where Moon, this proselytizer was using scientific experiments to try to prove the existence of God, to try to prove the theory of intelligent design. That's about as far back as I go. But I really do see like Michael Moore as kind of this emergent moment that is really the jumping off point for the rest of the project. That the kind of proliferation of feature length conservative documentary films and videos really do start in earnest in the attempt to rebut the claims found in Michael Moore's films. And so I think it's really from there, from kind of 2000-ish forward, that you really see the proliferation of films, again, against Michael Moore, against Obama. I think this was another trend that I noticed quite quickly, is that most of the conservative documentaries I could get my hands on were about rebutting, refuting, counteracting claims of kind of existing prominent progressive figures or proposals. Not that there wasn't like a positive core, a kind of agenda of their own, rather than just negating or drowning out, right, and the voices of others.
Yeah, I think the drowning out part is the important part. I think in many ways it's like, rather than actually focus on what these progressives might be saying, it makes more sense to just put your hands over the ears and say, nah, I'm not listening, and therefore just somehow refute the person personally. So, of course, AOC gets marked, the way they get at her, they constantly talk about how she was a waitress, a bartender. So that somehow is a negative, and that's how they refute what anything she might say. And as you pointed out a little earlier, the same way with Michael Moore, his Wade, his other, and of course Obama, his Kenyan father becomes, the key to the whole thing all over and over again. So I think those are good examples. I think you start right from the beginning, and probably one of the more well-known of these folks is Steve Bannon, who obviously worked for Trump, although to this day I'm not completely sure what he was trying to do, whether he was doing it just for his own, what he wanted, and therefore felt, obviously there was no question in the Trump administration, the concept of chaos and confusion was very important. Now, whether it was deliberate or not, I don't know how much we can say that, but somebody like Steve Bannon clearly does what he can to try to confuse. And you talk about his film about the 2008 economic crisis as an example, a great example of a documentary film from a conservative point of view that has no real argument, has no real attempt to educate, but just to continue with the confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that film is called Generation Zero. And I came across Steve Bannon, without knowing anything about him. And in fact, when I first started looking at these films that he made, many of them with the kind of conservative production company Citizens United, he was just the listed director on IMDb when I looked it up, and I didn't go much further than that. So, I was kind of taken by surprise when then Bannon became, this such a recognizable figure when he became associated with Trump, whereas, he'd just been kind of, again, a name that I was citing in parentheses when I looked at these films. But yeah, the film Generation Zero, attempts to offer an explanation for the financial crisis and the subprime housing bubble that kind of crystallized in 2008. And one of the things that really jumped out at me watching that film, and I will say that, to sit with these films and videos, many of which are released directly to DVD or online. Not a lot of them play in theaters. Some of the films directed and starring Dinesh D'Souza have played, widely, but a lot of these take a little time to track down. And in fact, I found some of these in like local libraries around Colorado, which is itself a kind of like a troubling discovery. But in watching these films, they are quite monotonous, again, because they are always just coming back to the same talking points, the same narratives, the same arguments over and over again. And so one of the things I was really looking for were there examples that would help to crystallize, that perhaps magnified some of the common rhetorical techniques that I think are dominant in a lot of conservative media. And the one that jumped out at me watching Generation Zero was its heavy reliance on stock footage and archival materials to make really the most outlandish claims, right? You call them historical arguments, but not really, right? Because if one of the things I point to in Generation Zero is that in this 10-minute sequence, it goes back to stock footage of white suburban housewives spoiling their children that then, according to the logic of the film, produced this entitled generation of the 60s and 70s. And then, as we're getting the narration and in the interviews that are explaining these historical sequences, we're seeing, Woodstock, archival footage, then cut to stock footage of yuppies driving in convertible cars in the 80s, all leading to the claim that the spoiling of children in the 50s produced the entitled generations of hippies and radicals in the 60s and 70s, and that somehow by the film's kind of historical timeline, those would have been the people, in Wall Street, repackaging subprime mortgage bonds into these complex derivatives, and so this is somehow the explanation for this major crisis. And so again, it's not exactly an argument so much as if you were to watch this assortment of stock and archival footage from 1950s to the present, how would you turn that into some sort of narrative? It's in effect what they've done, and yet I've heard these claims repeated. Both anecdotally, just talking with conservative folks, in my family or in my circle, or just even seeing, claims that continue to come up in places like Fox News and Breitbart that the 2008 financial crisis was, the government forcing banks to give loans to poor people. Like,
this episode is brought to you by HP Instant Ink. No one is reading your mind, but HP Instant Ink knows when your printer is running low and sends you new cartridges, so you never have to think about ink. Save up to 50%. You'll pay less than $5 a month for ink and never run out again. Find out if your printer is eligible and enroll today at hpinstantink.com. Conditions apply. For details, visit hp.com/instantink Spotify. This episode is brought to you by Madewell. Ready to step up your denim game? The experts at Madewell use premium fabric and the latest denim technology to make super comfy, never want to take them off jeans in fits and styles for everyone. The kind of jeans you'll reach for again and again. Get $20 off your online jeans purchase by using code Spotify20 at Madewell.com. Terms apply. Please see Madewell.com/promos for full offer details.
Every day can bring changes, challenges, and opportunities that can also change your personal or business financial goals and priorities. As a true partner, Sandy Spring Bank can make it all a bit easier. Someone who really listens, understands, and then creates solutions in hard times and good times. We'll always strive to be your advocate, today and every day. That's real banking for real life and real business. Visit sandyspringbank.com/real. Member FDIC.
And of course, anything that's got real evidence says the exact opposite, that it was the lack of government oversight to a large extent that led to so much of it, because you let somebody do whatever they want to do, and the chances are good they're going to do what they want to do, and especially if there's money involved. The other thing you talk about a lot is and you've already touched on it, is the religious aspect, that religion and fundamentalism and those kind of issues are particularly important in many of these films, that, as you say, they may well have been the underlying aspect of it, and that these films, which probably work out as perfect examples, because if there's one thing that you can't prove, it's the existence of anything that a religion's going to believe. I mean, anybody who says they can prove it can't. They can say what they believe, and they can say what they can use faith, but in the end, they're not going to be able to point out, and that's where it can get particularly tough when you're around conservative people who use things like, well, God was watching us, and then you want to say to them, well, what about all the other people? What's he doing about them? Why isn't he watching them? Why were you so special? And you can't have those arguments because they're circular. You're never going to win, and that's, I think, where you've pointed out in many of these other films, they've all come off on the idea that instead of using arguments that are based in facts and evidence, we're just going to use arguments to make our point, and who cares what evidence we use.
Well, and I think that it takes me back to the title of the book of Beyond Bias. One of the things I intend by naming the book that way is number one, to get away from this idea of bias. Bias is, I think, a term that gets thrown around so much in talking about political media. Certainly in the way in which conventional reporters and documentarians have dealt with Fox News and conservative media at large. Certainly in the way in which conservative media spends a lot of its time, pointing out what they call liberal bias in the mainstream media. But I think, especially as it relates to questions of belief and of ideology and of claims to truth, that bias, I think, is a kind of unavoidable feature of human existence, that we are all biased by the limitations of our experience, of what we've taken in, of what has influenced us. And I think one of my favorite examples, I think, that illustrates this is in the chapter on fundamentalism, where the 1991 documentary "Blood in the Face" that looks kind of in an observational way at a group of neo-Nazis in rural Michigan, and is seeking to expose and uncover the persistence of kind of white supremacy in this country, but also runs into a bit of a problem ethically, that in trying to be observational and trying to be objective and trying to avoid bias on the side of the filmmakers, it raises the question, is like, well, what if the film that you're making is just becomes a recruitment tool for the very subjects, for the institutions that you're trying to expose or to critique. And in fact, like one of the late interviews with the leader of this neo-Nazi group, he says as much on camera. He says, basically, I don't care what you do with this footage. We're happy for your cameras to be here at our meetings and at our picnics, because from their perspective, they just want to get their message out there, right? And they don't care. And I think, to me, that particularly fraught moment of how does one represent, right, the most kind of vile belief systems and institutions, right, and do it in a kind of objective, informative way, while also not reproducing the very thing you're trying to expose.
So let's back up a little bit. I mean, we've been not backing up so much. We've been all over the place, but we're hitting things from the book. But after your introduction, in which you lay out a lot of the theory and other points for everything you want to try to say in the book, you talk about the concept of hysterical bias, and this is why I said at the beginning that word hysterical and hysteria is so important. What do you mean by hysterical bias? And because obviously some of the material you put in here are your own, a lot of it's your own ideas and things that you developed over time. So when we talk about hysterical bias, what are we talking about?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a big question. I have to say, honestly, I shied away a little bit from kind of taking on the concept of hysteria in this project for quite a while, and in part because it has such a troubled history, in the West especially of particularly of disciplining female and female identifying bodies as hysterics, right? Hysteria is a term that we use, in everyday language, often to denigrate the expression of emotion, and it's certainly in the history of the clinic and of the psychoanalytic clinic in particular. Of controlling the hysterical female body. Again, these are kind of troubling histories that are attached to that term. But nevertheless, what I found so useful about hysteria, apart from the fact that it was just kind of continually thrown around, again in kind of in the journalistic record and responses, especially to people like Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity and whatever else, that one thing I noticed had maybe been underdeveloped in the psychoanalytic archive in discussions of hysteria is that hysteria is a kind of affective excess and trauma that occurs when we are caught in moments of ambivalence, in structures that are not of our choosing, that limit our freedom, that limit our expressions of desire. And if we go back to Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud and their studies on hysteria and the young women that they were treating, those expressions of hysterical symptoms often emerged in situations where these young women were caring for ill relatives, had desires that, because of the kind of cultural and historical moment they were living in, they could not express. And so hysteria was a kind of complaint, a form of protest that lacked a vocabulary, that maybe lacked viable means of expression, or kind of political outlet. And so I definitely throughout the book connects to this archive on hysteria as a reasonable form of complaint, of an expression of protest against the establishment or the established order before an answer has yet arisen as a possibility. But then what I noticed in conservative media was kind of the perpetuation of this complaint, of complaint for its own sake, of complaint as a form of, as we've said earlier, of drowning out virtually any other alternative viewpoint. And some of the examples I point to that I think illustrate quite usefully this kind of hysterical discourse is the ways in which conservative speakers often mimic or repeat back with a slight change whatever they're hearing from the other side. So I think like All Lives Matter as a response to Black Lives Matter is a hysterical response, right? It's not a active political platform. There's no like platform for the All Lives Matter movement. All Lives Matter is a retort that seeks to depoliticize, right, the claims on behalf of Black Lives Matters, and so I think there's these acts of depoliticization, of noise, of kind of stealing the forms, the kind of ideas of the other side without actually engaging them. Even the label of fake news, right? The way Trump took fake news, which was a label that had just emerged, in the 2016 election, looking at, Russian hackers that were trying to influence, the American election. He took that term and then made it his kind of blanket way of describing any and all news stories or news organizations that painted him in a negative light. And so I think that's what I'm getting at when I talk about hysterical conservative discourse, is this commitment to form at the expense of content, the commitment to spectacle that avoids, a thorough debate or really the onset of a real disagreement. And I think this is true throughout the various case studies I look at, is that again and again, these conservative films are trying to stop the debate before it really gets started.
Well, that's it. I mean, it comes down to one of the things that those of us who have memory of the political system before the current time, where you can actually have an argument where two people are on opposing sides and yet have an argument with actual facts and data without turning it into what the phrase you used, I know you are, but what am I? Where the idea that somehow you attempt to come to agreement. Of course, every time nowadays, whenever there's a political discussion, they'll say, well, what the people want is both sides to talk to each other. And yet there really isn't a particular benefit in many ways to do that, because part of what we're arguing about is the argument, not what you're trying to argue, but the actual argument. You use the term noise in Chapter 3. Can you explain, because obviously you're using it based on the concept of bias, but using the word noise. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know you get involved with a number of theoretical political folks and their ideas and how all this ties together. And I think Chapter 3, you go into a lot of detail about that. You do throughout the whole book, but I don't even want to try to say some of these names because I'll probably butcher them. So I'll let you talk a little bit about how the discourse theory related to politics and how this all relates to documentaries.
Yeah, for sure. By noise, I have in mind the French political theorist Jacques Rancière and his account of political aesthetics. And to try to summarize Rancière quickly, when he talks about noise, he has in mind what he calls the kind of policing of the political and the distribution of the sensible that in a democratic society. There will inevitably be constituencies and groups and peoples that whose voices have not been heard, right? Who have not been accepted into the kind of political hegemony as it exists, right? And that when these outsider groups, or what he calls the part who have no part, make claims that something is wrong, that they have been left out, the one of the kind of conventional moves of the established order is to try to reduce these political claims as mere noise, right? As speech that is not deserving to be heard. And so I think one way that we might point to this is right-wing critiques of Black Lives Matters, right? That one of the ways I think in which the right wing attempts to police this kind of current civil rights movement and these calls for justice is to denigrate them, not in terms of their actual kind of political claims, right? But to say that, well, what they're asking for is impossible, and to emphasize, those small number of protests across the country that led to the burning down of buildings and destruction of property, that time and time again, the retort, right, is to reduce these political claims of a wrong to bare noise, right? As this is not the right time, this is not the right place. There's no sense to it. We couldn't possibly defund the police. This is nonsense. But that's a kind of political gesture. It's a form of rhetoric. So that's like Rancière's account of noise. What I noticed in the conservative media that I focus on throughout the book is that rather than reducing the other side to noise, or rather than denigrating the political claims of their opponents, the conservative films actually use noise as one of their go-to gestures, again, as a way of drowning out and confusing the debates at issue. And to me, like, the perfect example of this is in one of the anti-Michael Moore films, Fahrenheit 9/11, which was a response to Fahrenheit 9/11. Michael Moore, makes it's not the most important argument in Fahrenheit 9/11, which is not one of my favorites of his. But he points out that Bush was spent more time on vacation than any other president in modern American history, right? Which, I don't know, maybe Trump's golfing trips have now exceeded that. So Michael Moore makes an arguable point, right? Like, Bush spent a lot of time on vacation. during his presidency. Now, in response to that, in Fahrenheit 9/11, this conservative rebuttal, there's a sequence where they take one of Bush's vacations where he went back to his ranch on Texas, and they're listing all of the official meetings and kind of important work that he was doing while he was on vacation. Now, at the level of just like disagreement or debate, this is actually a reasonable point, right? That Michael Moore makes his claim, Bush is always on vacation. The rebuttal is, well, he's actually working when he's on vacation, in which case it's not a vacation. That would be a reasonable point, right? But what happens in the sequence is that they list so many of his official activities and they scroll up and down up the screen so quickly that you can't actually read the information. And so this takes me back to like the Glenn Beck chalkboards, that the data is so excessive, right, that we lose touch with what the point that's being made. Confusion reigns, right, rather than explanation. And so that's my little kind of tweak to Rancière's political theory around noise, is that they're actually using noise, again, in a way that is actually counterproductive to their own argument.
Because it's actually, even though it has the patina of evidence, it's not really evidence because they don't actually use the data in the argument. They make the argument, but then they don't give you the absolute ability to verify the argument they're making. They just scroll a bunch of information, and all it ends up doing, as we've talked about with some of the other ones, is confuse you more than anything else, or put you in a position where you just accept it because it's easier that way, because anything else would require you to think about it too much, and they're not there to try to, they want to make their arguments, and they're going to make it in a way where they can make a point, and whether you agree or disagree is impossible because you don't have the evidence one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where it speaks to, it goes back to, I think, the conservative economic model of cable news, of committing to certain narratives and certain talking points, regardless of context, so that, if one was paying attention to just kind of mainstream news last January, last February, there was already news about COVID, starting to spread around the globe, so that, once it started to break out in Washington State and some other places. Of course, it was troubling, horrifying, difficult, but there was a sense of, at least for me, like it wasn't a terrible surprise at that point, right? It had already spread so far and wide. Whereas if you were consuming, I think, conservative media, watching Fox News at that time, there was no coverage of what was going on in the world, as is often the case. There's not a lot of global news that's offered, so that then, when this major event happens, it's not terribly surprising that then, conservative speakers and politicians are rushing to kind of create these, these stories of evildoers who are out to get us, when in fact the entire world is succumbing to this pandemic.
And sort of interesting and related to that is the fact that Trump and obviously then Fox News would use the same excuse. Well, we didn't want to panic anybody, so we wanted to be real. We didn't want to say things that would panic people, and yet in the end, they tend to like to panic people anyway. So it was an interesting an excuse to not talk about it. Where, of course, back then especially, you don't go outside of the mainstream, and the mainstream for them would have been Trump, his people, and so on and so forth. I wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about bits and pieces. We're sort of all over the place, but I think we've hit many of the major topics in the book. But how successful are these? I don't mean now with getting their information across. Is there money to be made by these conservative filmmakers? How many people are watching these?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to say, and it's really not. That's not the kind of work that I do, of digging into the kind of audience analysis. Although I think it's a perfectly reasonable question, and it's worth looking at. To be quite honest, when I realized I wanted to write a book on conservative media, the prospect of looking at the never-ending archive of talk radio or of Fox News was not something I was jumping.
I was going to ask you. I'm going to mention at the beginning. Thanks for watching all these, so the rest of us don't have to.
Yeah, right. It's not the first time I've heard that. And so when I started looking at these feature-length films, what at the most practical level, what I saw was the kind of condensation of many of the arguments you would hear on a day-to-day basis, in places like Fox News, in part because the films are made by many of the same people. They include interviews with many of the same people. So whether the Steve Bannon films or the Citizens United films and videos are reaching a wide audience, I don't know. But I think they are kind of crystallizing and perpetuating these kind of talking points and these narratives that I think are undeniably influential on in right wing kind of spheres in a way that I think. In a way that is still hard to fathom, and yet it kind of makes sense that Trump could claim that the election was fraudulent in advance of the election happening, right? If I lose, it's fraudulent, and that people would believe this. I don't want to go too far and say that it's all conservative media that's making this possible. I think it's more complicated than that, but I do think that the kind of echo chamber, as it's called, of private universities and cable news and talk radios and books and fiction films and documentary films, that there's ways in which conservatives in this country can embed themselves in this echo chamber of self-fulfilling prophecies of always kind of hearing the same message over and over again. And so I think the films and videos contribute to that, but they're certainly I don't think they're widely viewed, not in the way that, again, like the Tucker Carlson show is on an evening.
Yeah, I know. And like I said before, that's where you can almost. I live in northern Kentucky, northeast Kentucky, right on the West Virginia border, and right below Ohio. So generally speaking, it can be very conservative. Although the small city I live in has a definite Democratic stronghold. I mean, it's like in most states, the big cities are almost entirely going to end up being Democratic or at least blue-leaning, and then you get into the rural areas. And I actually had a person say to me, Trump had to have been a fix, and they said the reason is, I can't imagine why anyone would vote for Joe Biden, and because they wouldn't do it, they just assume the rest of the world's the same way. And this is where this whole idea of, well, I believe it, therefore it must be true.
Yeah. Well, and I think to flip it, that's also one reason why I thought it was important to write this book, because I think it is quite easy to dismiss and denigrate kind of the right wing and of conservative media, from a kind of liberal knee-jerk perspective, like it's all nonsense, it's just stupid, it's irrational. And again, I understand those responses, but I think it's also important to take seriously, right, the kind of rhetorical structures and the conceits and the aesthetics, because at the very least they are effective, right? They are impactful on people. Exactly.
If 67% of Republicans supposedly believe that the election wasn't fair, then that's a sizable part of the population. It's not the majority of the entire population, but that's the number I saw the other day. And I don't know how perfect the poll was, but it sounds right that there would be that, because they've been told since, as you pointed out, even before the election, that it had to have been fixed if he doesn't win. Have you read anything or gotten any information as to any thoughts about what about the concept of conspiracy theory and conservatism? I mean, I know conspiracy theory has been around for a long time, but it just seems that lately so much of because they tend to be anti-government, many of the conspiracy theories. And have you seen? I know I'm probably putting you on the spot again, just the same way with the popularity of some of this. It just seems to me that they all seem part of the same concept, where you want to argue something that's unprovable, and so the only way you're going to argue it is to say, well, I'm sure it's true, or something to that effect, where so much of these concepts are almost based on the idea that there must be something behind the scenes that's doing it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's not something that I delve into, as you mentioned,
Right.
too much in the book. I mean, I do point to Richard Hofstadter on paranoia, um, and I
As
think
hysteria and paranoia tend to go together quite
for
well.
sure, for sure. Mark Andreevich has written a bit around kind of conservative conspiracy theories in his wonderful book Infoglut. Jody Dean has done some on this. I think what I would say is this gets to one of the things I haven't really talked about today. This what I call the economies of inattention,
Right.
and this comes up in
That's one of the chapters that we sort of, that's probably one of the few things that we haven't brought up too much at all.
Yeah, this comes up in this is the chapter on anti-Obama
Hmm.
uh, documentaries, and I think just real quickly, one of the things that happens there in Dinesh D'Souza's film 2016 Obama's America, which did play widely in theaters. It was a wide release in cineplexes that came out. Around the time of the 2012 election or in advance of that election as an attempt to sway the election between Obama and Romney. And of course, this is where conservatives are actually mimicking Michael Moore to go back to Moore releasing Fahrenheit 9/11 in 2004. Um, but one of just the basic moves that D'Souza makes in 2016 Obama's America is to subtract any historical context from Obama's presidency, and then to again, to try to scare people, to ask the question, why did Obama all of a sudden restrict drilling offshore in the Gulf of Mexico? Right, that's so strange. Maybe is he trying to destroy our economy? Does he not like America? It leaves out the entire BP oil spill that had devastated that region. So it's inattentive. The film is inattentive to historical context that then I think lays the groundwork for hysteria. Like, what's going on? Why is Obama doing these things? Well, because we haven't told you any of the kind of contextual historical information that would explain his actions. Which again, like you could disagree with Obama's actions. That would be a reasonable thing to do. But again, the films aren't going that far as to stage a disagreement so much as they are again trying to hystericize their audience. So I think to get back to the question of conspiracy theories or something like QAnon, I would speculate, and I might want to look at this going forward, that the ways in which conservative media remains committed to their narratives, remains committed to offering pop psychological interpretations of their opponents and their opponents' intentions, does kind of create fertile ground for conspiracy theories to gain hold, I think, in audiences that might not have otherwise succumbed to them, right? That, again, to go back to COVID, if all of a sudden the country is shutting down as the virus is spreading, but your preferred media outlets never talked about what was going on in China or Italy or Germany or wherever else before the virus got here, you're kind of set up for then the kind of conspiracy theories that circulated that this was, manufactured in a lab in Wuhan, and then this is the start of World War III or something else. So I think there is a kind of resonance between what I call hysterical conservative discourse and then the proliferation of conspiracy theories.
We've talked about the book for an hour, and yet I still feel like there's so much in there that we could talk about further. I do think the whole concept of using stock footage, like, and you talk about that, and we talked about it briefly, but that is in the last chapter, the final chapter before your conclusions, that the concept of using stock footage so much as opposed to, and having it not really mean anything, as opposed to, I mean, obviously Michael Moore uses stock footage. I mean, other documentarians use stock footage, but they don't usually use it to try to illustrate a point. It's usually used for transition or to make a often humorous point or something that's not that important to the overall structure of the argument. But so that's in the last chapter. But and then of course one of the ones you mention in when you talk about stock footage is Atomic Cafe, which is of course not one of those films, but it is still one of my favorite documentaries of all time. I know I said Michael Moore was one who sort of pushed me back into documentaries, but I think it was probably more likely Atomic Cafe, because I did see that, and that made it into theaters, and I still think to this day it's one of the most interesting documentaries. But it has no narration. It has no narrator, which you talk about quite a bit in chapter 4, the idea of a direct documentary, and yet if you're willing to give it the thought that it needs, it makes its point.
Yeah, well, and I think that's it's again one of the kind of practical, or the argument began with a practical problem, um, of, much as I didn't want to, gear so much of my life to watching, Fox News every day or listening to talk radio. I also realized that I was writing about objects, these conservative films, that would be new to most of my readers, right? And so I thought to myself, well, maybe a helpful way of contextualizing and giving the readers a way in would be to look at more conventional documentary films, as I do really in every chapter. But then, that kind of practical decision or pragmatic decision then actually produced, I think, some insight. Is that what I found the conservative films doing was kind of magnifying these kind of ethical problems and aesthetic difficulties that are true of just any documentary film, right? How does one represent a historical events accurately? And of course, documentary filmmakers, play, around the edges of that line of, using archival footage in ways that might not be exactly, illustrative of the point that they're making. And that's just kind of a feature of nonfiction film, that filmmakers run across all the time. And yet, as I argue in that chapter on stock footage, the conservative films, just push that, to such ridiculous levels of making the most broad, overarching historical claims when their evidence is nothing but stock footage.
Right. And I mean, and yeah, it's still funny that Atomic Cafe uses old movies, what we would have called, educational films to a large extent, and yet almost every bit of it is meant to be hysterical. Everything's meant to make you scared. I mean, those films back then, that's what they were there for, is to scare you about the Russians, about the bomb, about this, about that, and how we have to be careful about all of it. And it is so funny that it just proves that the concept of trying to keep people scared is not new.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think the only thing I would add to that is that I think there is a way in which a lot of conservative media is trying to scare people, not so much to produce action, right, but to convince them that there's really nothing to worry about, to go about their lives. That if Obama is scary because he's a socialist, well, if everybody on the left is a socialist, that also implies that there's nothing special about Obama or AOC or Bernie Sanders or whatever else. And so I think that also fits back into this commitment to narrative and to a kind of these moral dichotomies, that the fear is again depoliticizing. It's a way to end the discussion. Like, no matter who you're hearing speak from the other side, they're always the same scary thing, right? So the scary thing is a feature of it, but I think also that it's always the same antagonist, right? Is central here.
Well, as I say, we've talked quite a bit around the book and about the book, and about a lot of it about your own experience with many of these the concepts. And once again, as I say, I appreciate that you went to all this trouble, because frankly, I don't know that I could spend 5 minutes with some of these films, because my fear is I'd turn them off so quickly, because it would be like I can't handle it. But I think the political aspect is important. Almost more than, I mean, the filmmaking part of it is important too, but I think the fact that they're out there and that they do seemingly have a point of view, even if it's not to actually tell you anything, is an important